Greetings, beautiful viewers, this is Smitten. Today I'm going to be trying out something new by covering something old. Something so old that most players in Smite have never seen, heard of, or even knew about. Even though I started playing back in December of 2012, I didn't even know about the majority of these. The cryptic history we'll be delving into today are 8 items that never made it to the live client. Before we dive into this list, I'll fill you in on a bit of history and the reason why I missed most of these items myself. Many of them never made it to a patch notes release. Their only evidence is from mysterious internal records of high-res and lurking in the deep catacombs of the various Smite fan sites. Rumors and whispers from insiders who saw either their devastating power or lackluster disappointment firsthand. For many of the items, we're talking about the Smite equivalent of prehistoric times. The mythical time told only through the epic sagas of internal testing. The epoch that allowed things like the mechanic and item stat focus to be unleashed on an unexpected player base in similar fashion to the bubonic plague in medieval Europe. I reached out to Hi-Rez Ponpon for assistance on the research of this video, an icon of mythical proportions from his time on the dominant Curse Gaming Pro team from the preseason days. With his help, I've managed to narrow down some of these dates, but they're still unclear without deep archaeological digs into the sedimentary layers that built the current game that we have today. So, without further ado, here are the top 8 items that never made it to the live client. Coming from the long-lost land of preseason, Hi-Rez was trying to figure out a way to force jungling to be a thing. This marked the death of the 2-1-2 meta. Jungling wasn't a viable option as there wasn't enough in the jungle to sustain a role on its own. Hi-Rez wanted to correct that and went through all kinds of experiments to make it happen. From this period of flux, an item emerged to help facilitate the emergent role. Coming in at number 8, Tribal Ward. This was a starter item that entered testing in early 2013. Records are foggy at best, but the stats were clearly underwhelming. Coming in at a cost of 750 gold, it provided 120 HP, 5 physical power, 5 physical protection, and 5% attack speed. It increased damage to minions by 20 per hit and reduced damage from jungle camps by 10% while providing 10% movement speed out of combat. This item was underwhelming and the precursor to Bumba's Mask, which was introduced on May 30th, 2013. Which was also a much different item than it is today. The original stats were a base 30 HP, with a passive that gave 25% increased gold and experience when you landed the killing blow on a jungle camp, along with 10% of your max health returned, and when killing the big creep, it gave you 25% increased movement speed for 4 seconds. Both were staggeringly underwhelming, and it's easy to see why Tribal Ward didn't make the cut. Even other starter items could edge it out in usefulness regardless of what role you were trying to fill. Tribal Ward died in testing as it quickly lost favor and didn't actually help to complement the role. However, the thought process was clear and the direction was markedly improved between the Granddaddy and Bumba's initial release. Jumping up to Season 4, we arrive at number 7, Talisman of the Relentless. This is an item modern PTS players may remember but probably forgot about, which is indicative of why it didn't make its way onto the live client. Coming in at a total cost of 2,250 gold, this defensive item offered 50 magical protections, 200 HP, and 20% crowd control reduction. While the base stats were already bland, the passive is what sunk this item into the oblivion it now rests in. When hit with hard CC, you gain a stack of the passive. At 3 stacks, the next time you're hit by hard CC, you become CC immune for 1 second. While that would be all well and good in a team fight, it could only occur once every 90 seconds, and stacks wouldn't build while this item was on cooldown. That last part was crippling. 90 seconds down, only to have to gain 3 stacks from being hard CC'd 3 times for 1 second of immunity? There were better options all over the item store, and Talisman of the Relentless rarely saw use. Once again, we go back to the beta days of preseason for yet another defensive item. This was back when crowd control reduction was relatively new, and all kinds of experiments were going on with it at the time. This is one of those experimental items that never made it past early 2013 and never saw the light of live client. Number 6, Rod of Will. A magical defense item that for the cost of 1,950 gold, offered 60 magical protections and 15 MP5. The passive garnered 30% crowd control duration reduction, but it wouldn't stack with the current champion of the stat bracket, Reinforced Boots. Fairly cheap for decent defenses, but it had the crippling downside of not stacking with the standard go-to for its passive. So its underuse found it wanting and destined to be cast aside. And now we've got our first active in a combined placement. This item dates back to October 18th, 2012 and saw rework into intensified defenses thanks to it being almost completely unused from the get-go. This active comes in at number 5 and was called Structural Invulnerability. Coming in at 500 gold, it offered an active that could be used even while dead that would render all allied structures, including phoenixes, invulnerable to damage for 6 seconds. Not insanely unattractive in comparison to the previous items, but it had a 5-minute team-wide cooldown for something that would, at best, delay an inevitable loss of an objective. The rework into intensified defenses provided towers with 50% additional attack speed, as well as dishing out 150 more damage per shot. It also forced the structures to target enemy gods, all of this for 10 seconds, coming with a 90-second cooldown and providing nearby structures 20 physical protections for those 90 seconds. This was definitely a better item than structural invulnerability, and in the early days of Smite, the towers and objectives were weaker than they are today. This was a futile attempt to allow players to mitigate the weakness, and ultimately, it too was removed for being underused and simply not fitting well within the game. Now we're starting to delve into items that weren't removed because they were underwhelming, but a tad too destructive for the game's own good. Coming in at number 4, this item was only ever available in in-house testing and had Freya written all over it. The passive might as well have said, build his core on Freya. The item was called Wrath of Heaven. For 2,715... Wait, 2,715? Yup, there was a 15 in there. For 2,715 gold, this item provided 90 magical power, 15% attack speed, and 15% CDR. The passive was a bit ridiculous, as when all your abilities were on cooldown, your basic attacks did an additional 50% magical damage based on your total magical power. This was back in the days when Freya was already a dominating force, and having an item that amped her up to 11 was totally unnecessary. Luckily for the community, Hi-Rez showed a rare moment of mercy and retired Wrath of Freya Heaven quietly behind the scenes. So, you know Soul Reaver? How about Chin Size? What would happen if you combined those items, gave it 90 magical power, 12 MP5, 15% CDR, and made it cost 2,970 gold? You'd end up with the number 3 item, Dementor's Doll. This ridiculous item existed for a week in internal testing before being removed in late December of 2012, and the passive did 8% of the target's max health as damage when hit with a magical ability, and could happen once every 3 seconds. The crazy thing? It was not only triggered on magical abilities, instant or channeled, but also dots. This is back before the original Al Kuang became Kukulkan, and his tornadoes would last long enough to proc this passive twice. Hades, Anubis, Freya, Ymir, Ra, Guan Yu, back when he was magical and had bongos, they could all utilize this as standard. Pretty much the embodiment of a totally broken item, and definitely one that I'm personally glad never saw the light of life client. Now for number 2, yet another active, and this one is still in the game in a drastically reduced form. Introduced on January 23rd, 2015 and removed just 1 week later on January 30th, Temporal Purification Beads. Why, oh why, would beads come in at number 2 on the list and be considered massively overpowered? Well, once every 90 seconds when you use this active, it would reduce your cooldowns not by 1 second, not by 2 seconds, but by 5 seconds. Maxing CDR and popping this would effectively enable a large swath of gods to dump almost their entire kits twice before you could effectively react. Teamfights would boil down to who dumped their kits and hit temporal beads first. It's clear to even the novice observer why this 1,000 gold active never made it to the live clients. When it comes to overpowered, it's hard to top Manikin Scepter, which is why it's number 1 on this list. This starter item was introduced on January 25th, 2015, and existed for only 5 days alongside temporal beads. For 800 gold, you would pick up 20 physical power and a ridiculous passive. Basic attacks would do 10 damage every second for 2 seconds, as well as applying an 8% slow for the duration. This sounds pretty harmless, but the fucker stacked 3 times for 60 damage and a 24% slow, effectively negating boots before your opponent could even get them online. A physical starter item that was like Daji's passive on steroids. Meaning that you could buy this bad boy on hunters, assassins, warriors, whatever the hell you wanted, and your initial engagement would almost always net a kill unless your opponents wised up and leveled their escapes first and hit under tower. Encountering an opponent with this item for the first 5 minutes of the game was simply devastating and made magic users almost totally irrelevant. This could have been the first time ever when 5 physical could have become meta, but Hi-Rez showed a rare bit of mercy and put this item out of our misery before the majority of the player base even knew about the bastard. While it was an interesting effect, it was so powerful you could only justify this as a part of a god's kit, and definitely exclude the possibility of having it exist as a starter item. Experience with this item is probably why when during the upcoming Daji buff, her 1 is getting the slow rather than her passive. With that said and done, we conclude this list. From the boring to the point of uselessness with Tribal Ward to the devastating to the point of game breaking in Manikin Scepter. I'm sure many in the community can breathe a bit easier knowing that many of these were discounted before they afflicted them. For whatever flaws Smite may have, at least they didn't inflict the top 4 in this list on us. If we tickled your fancy, make sure to rate and subscribe and don't forget to comment. Make sure to check out the description while you're down there for those links to my Twitch, Twitter, Facebook, and community Discord for all that Smitten goodness. Much love and luck in your future matches. This is Smitten, and I'll catch you in the next one. Mwah! Kakistan.